Yes, a very good evening from my side as well. Thank you very much for the renewed invitation to this very beautiful lecture hall, and it's a pleasure to be here. Of course, I was already afraid that I would be asked exactly these kinds of questions today. This means I give lectures on these topics quite often. Last night I thought, okay, what do I need to get done tomorrow? Oh, right, the Berlin lecture, let's get a little preparation done for that. Then you turn on the news, and of course everything ends up being a little different than planned. However, I do think it still makes a great deal of sense for me to tell you a bit, first, about what I've been considering and what I plan to discuss with you. This is mainly because I also believe that almost everything that has been presented since yesterday, I'm talking about those very undetailed proposals, that one can only speculate as to what their true meaning actually is. To engage in a reasonably informed speculation about this, which we can certainly and quite happily do together right after this, I believe it's both important and absolutely necessary to begin by offering some initial insights and background information. And that means not just focusing discussions on the Middle East and Israel in the aftermath of October 7th, but also taking the time to recall some central points that truly define the Middle East prior to October 7th. This perspective is vital because it's always crucial to keep in mind and reflect upon the historical context and the factors that led up to the current situation. How did we even find ourselves in this situation that has gripped us since October 7th and then subsequently observing Israel's rather successful military campaign against Hamas on one front and against Hezbollah and several other factions on another come to pass? How could this situation have even come about, one might wonder. So I'm going to attempt the following, and I'll keep it quite free form, because as I've already mentioned, I simply stopped preparing at some point last night while watching the news. First, I'll start with something that, based on my experience over the last year, I believe is truly necessary. First, I'll attempt to bring back to our collective memory exactly what we are discussing when we refer to October 7th. That was also, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, you noticed people were struggling for words. It wasn't easy to articulate what term accurately captures and defines what truly transpired in that situation. And I don't believe that feeling has entirely faded. And I think it's perpetually essential to remind ourselves repeatedly why this event constituted such a profound turning point, a genuine watershed, not only for the chronicles of Israel, its neighboring nations, and the broader region, but I believe one can assert this unequivocally, taking into account all subsequent ramifications, why this is a watershed moment in global political and world historical development in terms of the consequences that follow from October 7th. And from that point, I'd then like to discuss a development that actually started way back in 1979, but which dramatically carries on to this very day, especially in the aftermath of October 7th. Specifically, we're referring to a deeply negative development that, unfortunately, continues to persist, fundamentally shaping this conflict through what we've labeled in the title as the Iranian axis of resistance, with axis of resistance naturally placed in quotation marks. So, what historical role has this anti-Semitic Iranian axis of resistance played, and what role does it continue to play? That refers to the Iranian regime and its allies, including Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah in Yemen, commonly known as the Houthi rebels, and until recently also the regime in Syria as well. And then on the other hand, of course, not only because it's a welcome change to discuss something positive, but also because it's absolutely crucial for accurately depicting the situation, I'd like to delve into the normalization of relations between several Arab nations and Israel specifically, the Abraham Accords, a term we consciously chose to feature prominently in the title and subtitle of this very event. Because I believe that the debate about these proposals, which have been on the table since yesterday, can only be meaningfully conducted by considering their realism. I mean, just how realistic are these proposals in practice? What tradition do they follow? What would they lead to? If you consider that it's not solely this one particular movement, the persistent influence of the Iranian regime and its allies, but rather that you can observe, on the other hand, a highly constructive evolution unfolding in the Middle East over recent years, specifically a significantly heightened rapprochement among several very relevant Arab nations. And I would also immediately put forward the thesis that this is indeed the underlying reason for these statements. I wouldn't even call them mere proposals, but rather the pronouncements that emerged from the White House yesterday, ultimately serving as their very foundation. Their objective is very strongly focused on precisely continuing with this Arab-Israeli rapprochement, while at the same time more or less excluding the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip from the entire equation. Yes, and then I would also like to tell you a little bit about Germany's responsibility for the whole situation, because we also put that in the event description. This is, of course, important and necessary because, as you all know, these are developments that are happening relatively far from here, but they are all developments that have something to do with German policy toward the Middle East. They have something to do with German policy toward Iran. Therefore, I will also attempt to clarify what I mean when, in the announcement text, I state that German political decisions bore a direct co-responsibility for the massacre that transpired on October 7th. And I would like to extend that to the present time as well. There is also a direct responsibility of German foreign policy, in a profoundly negative sense, for the fact that Israel felt compelled, for entirely understandable reasons, to accept the truly insane conditions of these hostage deals, which was really unfortunate. It's consistently portrayed as a foregone conclusion, as if they're finally coming around to accept it. One really must consistently remind oneself that the conditions of these deals are utterly insane. It's truly abnormal when you're exchanging mass murderers who have been convicted 40 times over, or individuals sentenced to 45 years or 45 life sentences for very valid reasons for mere toddlers. It's an absolutely bizarre and disturbing exchange, right? The conditions that exist there are truly insane. And if there's applause, I might as well get this out of the way. Why German policy is partly responsible for this. These are insane conditions, and every single politician, male or female, who failed to unequivocally support Israel in retrieving those hostages immediately after October 7th, without any preconditions whatsoever, bears a share of the responsibility for the ultimate unfolding of these events. That would have meant that German foreign policy, which is not exactly powerless, would have taken action. It is one of the most important, wealthiest, and indeed one of the most influential nations in the world. This would have meant that from October 7th onwards, they would have exhausted every conceivable means, every resource at their disposal to exert immense pressure on the supporters and allies of Hamas. That there is no need for any negotiations at all, but rather that Hamas releases these hostages. This would have implied that German foreign policy should have, from the very beginning, exerted substantial pressure not only on Iran, but also, with considerable force, on Iran, Turkey, and Qatar. Germany had significant leverage, many ways to apply such pressure, which would have prevented Israel from ever encountering the dreadful situation of being forced to enter into such deals. But back to my first point, to the question, what are we actually talking about when we talk about this October 7th? And my experience since October 7th has shown me that it's simply impossible to encapsulate it all in a single simple term. What occurred there, and I believe this truly captures the very core of it all, encompassed a multitude of simultaneous events. And we absolutely must keep that in mind always. First and foremost, this was an astonishingly well-coordinated military attack. And this terrifyingly well simultaneously signifies a dramatic failure on the part of certain crucial elements within the Israeli security forces, which is a significant point. To provide some historical context, this stands as the second significant failure of the Israeli intelligence agencies. Intelligence officers always say that's a good track record, right? So it's not bad at all. One shouldn't badmouth the Israeli intelligence services, but we have to acknowledge, yes, this was, of course, the second major historical failure of the Israeli security services, especially the intelligence services. And it is no mere coincidence that it occurred precisely on the 50th anniversary of that initial significant intelligence failure, an aspect frequently glossed over in much of the coverage. But I seriously doubt that this is a mere coincidence, particularly when you consider the mastermind behind this attack, Yahya Sinwar. He spent years in Israeli prisons, and for very good reasons. During his time there, he became remarkably proficient in Hebrew, meticulously studying Israeli history and delving deep into the Israeli psyche. Studied, which is also vitally important for the very conception and detailed planning of these kinds of attacks. And he meticulously planned for this October 7th assault to occur precisely precisely on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War's commencement. October 6th to 7th marks the 50th anniversary of what is known on the Arab side as the October War of 1973 and in Israel as the Yom Kippur War. That was the first significant and truly catastrophic failure of the Israeli intelligence services, leading to truly dire consequences. I'm referring to the surprise attack in 1973, primarily orchestrated by Syria and Egypt. At the time, the prevailing security forces, even though some individuals held dissenting views, underestimated the threat. That was the first great failure, and October 7th must unfortunately be considered the second. That could honestly be a whole lecture on its own, but to contemplate what unfolds next, one could certainly look at the developments in Israel following 1973. A great deal happened there, both in foreign and domestic policy, following that intelligence failure in 1973, and there are certainly parallels to the situation today. Perhaps we can explore that topic in more detail together later on during the discussion and the question and answer session. However, October 7th was not merely a terrifyingly well-coordinated military assault that Israel failed to anticipate. More profoundly, it also unequivocally constituted a pogrom. Because it wasn't just the Hamas elite who carried out these attacks, who unleashed such incredibly brutal violence, and who took hostages. On the contrary, once the border was breached, significant portions of what's often referred to as the Palestinian civilian population actively participated in these events, and because of that, it consequently acquired the distinct character of a pogrom given its very nature. Thirdly, and inevitably, one must discuss both the sheer quantity, a rather dreadful term to use here, I admit, and the inherent quality of the violence, and indeed these specific attacks. In terms of quantity, I think it's very easy to show why this is such a watershed moment, why it's something exceptional. If you open any book about the history of the Middle East conflict, which oddly enough invariably refers to the conflict between Israel and its neighbors, any history, that is, of the so-called Middle East conflict, whether it's in German, English, or even Israeli narratives, the Second Intifada is always considered a major turning point, a watershed moment. Why? Because over 1,000 Israelis were murdered, right? Because the peace negotiations came to a halt, and so on and so forth. However, during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, it took a prolonged 4 to 5 years until more than 1,000 Israelis had been murdered. And as you all know, October 7th was accomplished in just a single morning. So the sheer numbers alone make it profoundly clear why this marks such a significant turning point. Then, of course, there's the utterly extreme and brutal quality of the violence that was employed. It was an anti-Semitic and misogynistic orgy of violence, specifically and brutally directed against women that took place there, unleashing a horrifying scene of brutality. And I think it should come as absolutely no surprise that people, especially in Israel, quickly found themselves reminded not of the Shoah itself, not of Auschwitz, but rather of specific images stemming from the Shoah, images from the mass extermination carried out under National Socialism. On the one hand, we are confronted with this pogrom-like character, which perhaps stirs up memories more akin to the pogroms witnessed in Tsarist Russia. However, on the other hand, we must also consider the actions of what I will quite deliberately refer to as the HAMAS death squads. The systematic killing that occurred there, an approach solely focused on annihilation without any ulterior motive, was so profound that I believe it would be truly peculiar if those who have deeply studied the Holocaust weren't struck by a powerful sense of déjà vu, recalling certain chilling images, a feeling of familiarity with such horrific events. Perhaps you all recall, to cite just one example, that small bus station, a kind of semi-bunker, where 20 or 30 individuals fortified themselves, and then people arrived from outside throwing hand grenades in. That's precisely the method of these death squads. Yes, you go to a place and attempt to kill as many people as possible, and it would have continued unabated if the IDF hadn't, albeit much too late, eventually stepped in to bring an end to it. And it means this specific violence did in fact possess a genocidal nature. So the accusation that South Africa and many others, including certain misguided leftist students across numerous campuses, have been leveling against Israel for a long time, an accusation of genocide against its self-defense measures and its admittedly harsh yet necessary actions, is actually an absurd, ultimately projective inversion. Actions of the Israeli army against the infrastructure of terror. This genocidal nature is seen precisely in the October 7th violence. October 7th predominantly due to the fact that the very concept of genocide inherently hinges upon the perpetrator's intent. And the intention behind these preceding groups' actions was completely unambiguous, because Israel isn't simply confronting ordinary terrorist organizations. Rather, it is confronting deeply anti-Semitic terrorist organizations. And it's not merely some extra feature. They aren't just radical Islamists who are terrible and happen to be anti-Semitic. Rather, this anti-Semitism is an absolutely central and core tenet of the ideology that motivates these individuals. And any political science analysis that fails to center this in its overall examination, any such analysis, is fundamentally flawed. It simply cannot comprehend the motivations behind these individuals' actions or why they proceed in the manner that they do. Because that's precisely where this intention ultimately stems from. Let me rephrase it. If you watch the videos, they broadcast it live, and you could actually witness it. This, incidentally, marks a substantial divergence from National Socialism, where they meticulously endeavored to conceal and keep all mass atrocities secret. Hamas militants equipped themselves with body cams and helmet cameras, broadcasting their atrocities live through various streams, and at times even exploiting their victims' own phones to reach family members and other contacts. Thus, a significant disparity in approaches is discernible. You cannot truly grasp why such events unfold, why this particular kind of destruction for its own sake takes place, without centering this anti-Semitic ideology in your analysis. And that is something that occurs far too infrequently, in my opinion. And that soon brings me to Iran, because that ideological impetus for anti-Semitism ultimately originates from the Iranian regime. However, October 7th also encompassed other significant aspects. It was a horrifyingly well-orchestrated military operation. Indeed, it was an act of annihilation, the work of death squads, imbued with a pogrom-like nature, affecting Israel and its political ramifications. It was the end of an illusion. In Israel, specifically within the Netanyahu government, or rather, the Netanyahu administrations of the past 15 years, one might say there was also an illusion. The illusion that one can coexist with anti-Semitic terror armies, and that's truly what we're discussing here. Terror group is almost an understatement for them. It truly was a terror army, Hamas, and for Hezbollah that's completely beyond question, or at least it used to be, without a doubt. There was this prevalent illusion that even with anti-Semitic terror armies positioned directly at Israel's border, it was somehow possible to achieve some form of lasting, or at the very least, very long-term peaceful coexistence or understanding. The prevailing doctrine, much like before the Yom Kippur War, indeed existed back then as well, you see. This also existed regarding Hamas, particularly from the Netanyahu government, where it was suggested they were somehow deterred, wouldn't attack us, perhaps not even wishing to, but were chiefly concentrated on retaining power within the Gaza Strip. And to kind of foster and bolster this, will ensure they can at least cover their salaries and wages, you know. That's precisely why Netanyahu personally spearheaded efforts for millions in payments delivered in cash-filled suitcases from Qatar to go directly to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. This is, as many of you already know, a subject of intense domestic debate in Israel. The Israeli left suggests that Netanyahu had an interest in Hamas's existence, so he wouldn't have to create a state, and so on and so forth. I really don't want to elaborate on that. I think what's more crucial is that there was an idea, one that frankly couldn't be criticized in any way at all. It's not a reprehensible idea, is what I'm trying to say. The hope was, partly through these multi-million-dollar payments, through a kind of bribery in a way, to achieve a sort of corrupting influence, thereby convincing even an anti-Semitic jihadist terror force to declare, all right, we may want to eliminate you, but for now we'll postpone it. This illusion has not existed since October 7th. They realized that very quickly in Israel. In Germany, it was reported as if it was all just a project, and the war was only about Netanyahu and the evil right wing in Israel, which was, of course, nonsense. Very quickly after October 7th, as you all know, before October 7th, Israel had been marked by intense domestic political strife. While this turmoil didn't vanish after October 7th, it simply ceased to be a primary concern for the immediate period. There was a very rapid consensus that this illusion was shattered and urgently needed to be brought to an end, necessitating the complete destruction of the terror infrastructure. It became evident in the initial months, and I frequently stated in my lectures at the time, that this conflict would inevitably escalate into a war against Hezbollah. Anyone who wanted to know could have known, and in Israel everyone was aware of it, and that's precisely why, since October 8th, when Hezbollah became involved in the conflict, a fact often overlooked in Germany, Hezbollah swiftly decided on the 8th to participate in this war, initially through rocket attacks and subsequently through various other measures. The general consensus emerged that looking ahead, the moment would inevitably arrive when decisive action would have to be taken against these heavily armed terrorist forces. And by the way, regarding Hezbollah, this is a particular point for which the Netanyahu government has been consistently criticized by the Israeli left since at least 2012. I recall the first article from Haaretz, the left-liberal Israeli daily newspaper, that specifically faulted Netanyahu for not having initiated a preemptive war against Hezbollah much earlier than he did. That has been a position of the Zionist Israeli left, yes. So in 2009 and especially in 2012, they were saying, well, they don't have 150,000 rockets aimed at us yet. But if things continue like this, they eventually will. And that's exactly what happened, because Netanyahu actually shied away from that step. Thus, the man who in Europe is always branded a warmonger, among other things, was actually the one who acted with considerable restraint. From the viewpoint of Zionist elements within Israel, one could even argue he bears responsibility for Hezbollah's ability to develop to the point of possessing 150,000 rockets targeting Israel, which, apart from the Iranian regime, was identified as the primary conventional threat and indeed stands as one of the pivotal reasons why Israel, even after October 7th, hesitated for a very long time and waited a long time before carrying out the military strikes against Hezbollah very successfully, much more successfully than in the Gaza Strip, because there was a very well-founded fear of counterstrikes, you see. It's no small thing when some terror army has 150,000 rockets aimed at you. And in Israel, it was always assumed that Hezbollah's elite units were planning an attack exactly like the one that happened prior to October 7th, poised and ready to strike with full force. And that is indeed true. There was, shortly after the 7th of October, a brief period of contention among the Islamists. Haha, Sinwar essentially copied that from Hezbollah. It wasn't. I mean, in such intricate detail, yes, with attack tunnels and so forth, then conquering villages and taking hostages, all of that. That was Nasrallah's plan. It was a plan from the Secretary General of Hezbollah. And in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah's elite units, specifically trained and stationed there, had long been anticipating and preparing for precisely such an assault. And at first they were a bit offended because now, of course, the plan was gone, the element of surprise was gone, and so they debated for a long time. Well, not long, they briefly debated whether they should even participate in the war. However, that was indeed the deep-seated fear prevalent in Israel. Therefore, that was precisely what was being demanded at that time. I believe this is something we should also keep in mind for the ongoing discussion. Israel didn't, on October 8th, then decide to wage war on Hezbollah. Not on November 8th, nor December 8th, and not for much of 2024 either. Instead, what did they do? They demanded compliance with a UN Security Council resolution. So being so cautious, one can hardly act any more carefully. Just as a quick reminder, since 2006, since the last major Lebanon war, which Hezbollah had initiated, a UN Security Council resolution has been in effect. I emphasize Security Council resolution because these are not merely just thousands of non-binding UN resolutions. Most of these UN resolutions against Israel aren't Security Council resolutions, so you can pass them, but they simply have no binding effect. I'm referring to UN Security Council resolutions which have stipulated since 2006 and remained in effect in recent months that firstly, Hezbollah must be disarmed, which everyone knew would be impossible. Yet, it was of course still beneficial that it was formally documented. And because everyone knew it wouldn't happen anyway, certainly not by the few German soldiers who were temporarily sailing around off the Lebanese coast. That would have actually been their job to say, okay, we're disarming Hezbollah now. Knowing that would never happen, there's a second, even more crucial resolution. This was consistently demanded by Israel after October 7th and 8th, the complete withdrawal of Hezbollah forces at the very least to behind the Litani River. For months, Israel, in its daily communique, stated that the international community now finally needed to ensure this vital matter. This was endless years after that resolution had long been passed, and it was only after that didn't materialize that Israel ventured to take the relatively audacious and risky step of significantly opening up a new front against Hezbollah. You all know about the pager attacks and so forth. That was comparatively successful. How come? They'd been preparing for it since 2006. That's a key difference from the Gaza war. In the Gaza Strip, there was a serious assumption, what I previously labeled an illusion, that it would be entirely unnecessary to wage war against Hamas in such a fashion. Hezbollah, on the other hand, always knew that eventually things would reach this point. That's why things appeared somewhat improved there. However, October 7th was a different matter entirely. It marked an attack on the Arab-Israeli rapprochement process. And that leads me directly to my two other critical points, where I'd like to briefly take a historical detour. Iran on one side, and the burgeoning Arab-Israeli rapprochement on the other. Just a few weeks prior to October 7th, Saudi Arabia publicly announced for the very first time that they were engaged in peace negotiations with Israel. Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler, publicly stated for the very first time in an interview on an American television channel, we are conducting peace negotiations with Israel. And the reporter, as you can easily look it up and find it, visibly quite irritated because no Saudi has ever admitted such a thing before. I mean, everyone knew there were contacts and probably even peace negotiations, but it had never been officially confirmed. So he does it, and the reporter asks, how's it going? He replies, better every day. Very hopeful indeed. And ever since, there's been widespread speculation across Saudi, Israeli, and numerous other newspapers. Not really about whether it would happen or not, but just about whether it would take weeks or months. And an Israeli-Saudi peace treaty, which I'll revisit closer to the conclusion, would genuinely be a transformative game changer for the entire region, completely altering the existing dynamic and political landscape. This would also permanently dismantle the narrative, heavily influenced by Iran and certain anti-imperialist figures, which suggest that all Arabs inherently harbor hatred towards Israel. This deeply ingrained belief, constantly propagated, would be thoroughly and definitively shattered. Not merely to scratch the surface, as is currently happening, but to utterly and permanently dismantle it. And it was precisely against that backdrop that the October 7th attack was launched. Because, of course, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the PFLP all knew this, and the PFLP was also deeply involved in those attacks. One should bear in mind this is especially quite significant for the ongoing discussion in Germany. I'm not sure if any of you have dealings with universities, but when you witness these students who perceive themselves as pro-Palestinian, they are in actual fact disseminating Hamas propaganda. It's a concerning situation. If you just flat out tell them that, they often respond with, no, we're not really fans of Hamas either. If you just flat out tell them that, they often respond with, no, we're not really fans of Hamas either. That somehow makes it better, don't you think? That's why I always emphasize this. The PFLP was involved in the October 7th attacks. That's the PFLP, not to be confused with the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That is also an anti-Semitic gang of murderers, just one that comes from a Marxist-Leninist tradition. But even before October 7th, they were involved in the worst anti-Semitic massacres. It was PFLP members who, a few years ago in Jerusalem, attacked praying Jews with axes. So, you don't even need Hamas for that, whatever, but that's just a sideshow. But when we talk about the demonstrations and these occupations here, it's an important point, yes. The PFLP was an integral and active participant in this anti-Semitic massacre. They urged their members to get involved, and indeed both their male and female combatants actively participated in the events. This group, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the PFLP, they of course absolutely knew that there would be a truly fierce Israeli reaction to the horrific actions they were about to commit. Consequently, they were fully aware of the potential repercussions of launching an excessive number of rockets toward Israel, that it would inevitably lead to widespread bombings. They understood perfectly that such an attack would unleash a devastating war upon both the Israeli populace and the innocent Palestinian people, resulting in a colossal military response from the Israeli forces. And that's precisely why they launched such an attack, avowedly. They discuss it quite openly. They openly declare what their calculation was. They are proud that there is additional suffering among the Palestinian population because that perfectly serves their ultimate purpose. They're all going to die, so a martyr's death is a good thing anyway. but above all, it furnishes, it provides, it supplies them with the ammunition they need to act against Israel. And the political calculation was, and thankfully it only partially succeeded, the political calculation was this: a state like Saudi Arabia, a leading Arab power, cannot engage in peace negotiations with Israel if Israel is currently killing 40 or 50,000 Palestinians. And that's precisely how things unfolded initially. This means, fortunately, Saudi Arabia did not terminate these crucial peace negotiations. So, after October 7th and the operations, they didn't mention it. Israeli military actions. Okay, that's completely over. It's dead in the water. Instead, they merely stated it's been put on ice. And just a few days later, they publicly declared that as soon as the war concludes, it would be a different story. One can be very sure that they want the exact same outcome as Israel, for Hamas to be destroyed. Not only Israel wants this, but also Saudi Arabia, the Jordanian government, and especially the Egyptian government. They all hate the Muslim Brotherhood and see them as a major threat, and Hamas is nothing but the Palestinian branch of that very same Muslim Brotherhood. So, once this conflict concludes, Saudi Arabia states they are keen to re-engage in these peace negotiations. Thus, it's far from over. And what also isn't concluded, and in that regard, this aspect of the October 7th planners' calculation also didn't work out, is that not a single one of the Arab countries that in the preceding years, specifically in 2020, had signed the so-called Abraham Accords with Israel, has actually terminated those agreements. Not one of these nations has rescinded them. Right? Israel is currently engaged in its intense anti-terror war, and while these countries have voiced criticism regarding its approach and various aspects, not a single one has declared, that's it, we can no longer pursue peace with Israel. And that is quite remarkable, and truly, it is one of the very few positive aspects to which I will return in just a moment, because first I believe we need to illuminate the negative aspects a little further. All of this could have never happened in this fashion without the actions of the Iranian regime, and that must continue to be really put that at the center. It must be emphasized repeatedly. None of the groups, not Hamas, not Islamic Jihad, nor the PFLP, could have executed these attacks without years, even decades, of Iranian regime support. It is the Iranian regime that has provided both groups with millions and has financially supported Hezbollah with billions of dollars. It was the Iranian regime that initially supplied weapons, and later, after Israel became more effective at preventing those shipments, it provided the vital know-how and training to build those weapons and empower the operatives. This means it was comprehensive support. In summary, the Iranian regime is backing Hezbollah anyway. All those 170,000 rockets would not have existed without the Iranian regime, but also with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, without the Iranian regime, October 7th simply wouldn't have happened. And that brings me, to keep it a bit shorter, to the second major point about the responsibility of German politics. The Iranian regime is, in every conceivable way, profoundly anti-Semitic, rooted in traditional Islamic animosity towards Jews. Conspiracy-based modern anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, eliminatory anti-Zionism. I could easily give an entire separate lecture on that later on. The situation can be presented with complete clarity and comprehensiveness. Exactly. It is an anti-Semitic regime that actively translates this deeply ingrained anti-Semitism into a very concrete and armed political agenda. And then Holocaust denial. And now you might think, if one holds an idealistic political concept, then the nation asserting that Israel's security forms part of Germany's very raison d'etat would likely stand as the most stringent critic and adversary of this Iranian regime. And I'm probably not telling anyone in this room anything new when I say that the opposite is true. And more importantly, the exact opposite has been true for the entirety of the last 4 decades. And this is precisely the fundamental reason why it must be stated that German political actions carry a direct co-responsibility for the events of October 7th. Without considering the colossal billion-dollar transactions that German companies have pursued with unwavering political backing for over 4 decades, and this applies to all parties represented in the Bundestag without exception, as there are no substantial distinctions between them, even currently, virtually none whatsoever. Without these billion-dollar deals, Without the billions of dollars from the 2015 nuclear agreement, which Germany strongly championed, and without these colossal financial infusions, the Iranian regime simply wouldn't have possessed the capability to arm Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and all other groups in the manner that they did. And that is precisely why this immediate responsibility exists. And frankly, not much has drastically changed about that to this very day. Since I'm on this point, I'll go ahead and finish it. I usually end with this. If you currently visit the German-Iranian Chamber of Commerce's website, you will find many delighted articles about it. What has risen again? Some things have also declined. But in 2024, things in the realm of trade volume have also increased significantly between Germany and Iran. And we're not talking about illegal business, but rather legitimate business that isn't subject to sanctions. And nothing about that has changed since October 7th. That continues to be the case without exception. And nothing about that changed even after Ali Khamenei, the supreme spiritual leader in Iran, and absolutely all relevant regime newspapers celebrated October 7th without exception. They didn't say something like, now you've stolen the plan, that's not so good, and besides, we wanted to do it this way. Instead, they said it was an exemplary act of resistance. And after Hamas, a few days after October 7th, what they did on TV, I believe it was a Hezbollah channel, not Lebanese state TV. They said, we will do this again and again. So they declared, yes, this was not a mistake, we will repeat it over and over. We will keep repeating this until we pressure the state of Israel to such an extent that it absolutely cannot exist anymore. And then Ali Khamenei reiterated that, praising it with the highest accolades and declaring, this is precisely the correct course of action. And this is no coincidence, because October 7th was something else as well. It truly was the direct implementation of Qasem Soleimani's strategy, which he famously called the Ring of Fire. So, what exactly do I mean when I say the Iranian regime is not just anti-Semitic, but translates its policies into very concrete anti-Semitic military actions? I'm referring to two distinct things. The first is what's known as the Ring of Fire strategy, which is intended to encircle Israel. And the second point, which is now becoming increasingly relevant, especially since this Ring of Fire has been somewhat broken, or at least weakened, is the Iranian nuclear weapons program. Therefore, when we talk about Iran, we are referring to armed anti-Semitism, and potentially even nuclear-armed anti-Semitism. That's why it's so dangerous. And when I give lectures, say, generally on the critique of anti-Semitism, I always argue that if you formulate a global critique of anti-Semitism, you must place the Iranian regime and its allies at the center of that critique. Not because of some, personal preference of mine or anything like that, but because any critique of anti-Semitism must maintain some sense of judgment and has to prioritize. I say this so vehemently because I teach many students, and when they want to write a term paper or find a thesis topic in anti-Semitism, studies 90% of them say conspiracy theorists. We could also examine Iran, as they're really good at conspiracy theories, yet their targets are often akin to those critical of German policies here. And if you ask, who are the anti-Semitic actors? Jana from Kassel. And yes, well, that was this bewildered young woman who had gotten herself thoroughly confused. She thought she was Anne Frank, Sophie Scholl. I think it was Sophie Scholl. In any case, yes, she presented herself as one of those who are now rising up against the new National Socialism. And there were people at these protests who pinned yellow stars on themselves and did all sorts of terrible nonsense and also did anti-Semitic things. But to put it bluntly and to cut to the chase, Jana from Kassel did not aim 150,000 rockets at Israel. And these critics of measures don't have a nuclear program. Right? So once more, every manifestation of anti-Semitism should be criticized. That is entirely correct. However, you must make a proper assessment. You need to identify who truly poses the greatest danger, and subsequently, these groups, their structures, and their patrons and supporters must become the central focus of criticism. That's precisely why I seize every opportunity, even the most inconvenient ones, to speak about the Iranian regime and its inherent anti-Semitism. And that is indeed something that Israeli politicians, across all party lines, have incidentally been doing throughout recent decades. And the fact that they've been doing this for decades is anything but a coincidence. And here I'll jump back into history for a moment because I think it's important for understanding the current situation. It wasn't Benjamin Netanyahu, the first prime minister, to state that the Iranian regime needs nuclear weapons. Rather, that was Yitzhak Rabin. And I believe this can briefly highlight this simultaneous development that we are still experiencing live today, witnessing it unfold before our very eyes, right here and now. It starts in 1979. Quick history, 1979, two key events. The first Arab country to make peace with Israel, Egypt. Great, right? That peace treaty has been in effect ever since. Sadat paid with his life, as the Islamists didn't like the idea, but still, peace endures. At the same time, 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Iran essentially takes over the role that Egypt used to have, which was to call for the destruction of Israel as the leading Arab power. From 79, we had both. The emergence of this Iranian axis, declaring from the very beginning that the state of Israel must be eliminated. No discussions, no compromises, not even the pragmatism the Iranian regime shows on other issues, but not on Israel's destruction. Well, you might be aware of this, but there's a clock in Tehran. It's meticulously counting down the hours and days until the complete annihilation of Israel. It's a digital clock. In Israel, they joke about it because power outages are frequent. You might buy a few minutes that way, but unfortunately, it gets cranked right back up again. And this is meant very seriously because it's not just mere rhetoric. They are actively pursuing tangible policies to make it a reality, prospectively speaking. Ever since it has existed, the Iranian regime has always reacted to any rapprochement between Arab countries and Israel. Early 90s, what happens? The Oslo peace process. Why did it happen? One could give a whole other lecture on that. The collapse of the Soviet Union, Rabin's government, and so forth. A very important point, which is missing from almost all German language accounts of the Oslo peace process, is critical: the Iranian nuclear program. Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's prime minister, receives intelligence reports that they're constructing atomic weapons. This regime, openly threatening destruction and denying the Holocaust, is building nuclear weapons. And Rabin, being the very forward-thinking politician that he was, takes all possible measures. He calls on his envoys, including here in Germany, especially here, to convince the Allies to take all non-military measures against the Iranian regime. Trade boycotts, not giving them special treatment, politically delegitimizing them, and so on and so forth. It doesn't work at all. Germany does the opposite, intensifies its trade and engages in political sycophancy. In the early 90s, they even cooperated with Iranian intelligence. So while Iran is killing its opposition in Berlin, Ali Falahian, the then intelligence minister, is welcomed at the federal chancellery. This is truly a terrible story, isn't it? Because Rabin, already thinking it might not work out well, states, "We must establish long-range bombing capabilities." And that immediately shows you the gravity of the problem. Israel had no long-range bombers back then. Why would they? They were always fighting nearby. Long range was far too costly. Rabin says very presciently, it could happen. That the whole world leaves us alone with this problem. We hope not. We hope, and now we'll do this and that, but it's possible as a good Zionist, you naturally assume the worst. So you have to, at least in theory, put yourself in a position to be able to act independently and militarily against such a potentially existential threat, if necessary. And thirdly, he says, and this is why it's connected to this peace process, he says, we must try to make peace with our immediate neighbors in order to be able to devote ourselves to this threat. I always share this with right-leaning Israelis, especially those who often view Rabin as a naive peacenik and similar things. That's nonsense. He fought Arafat for 30 years, militarily and otherwise, and many others too. And one of the main reasons he took this risky step in the early 90s to say, okay, now I'll at least talk to him and maybe something will work out, is, I'll tell you in Rabin's own words. He said, we must neutralize the inner circle of threats to be able to devote ourselves to the outer circle of threats. The inner threat, ongoing conflict with Palestinians and most Arab neighbors. At that time, only one country had peace with Israel, Egypt. The outer circle of threats, a potentially nuclear-armed Iranian regime. Not such a bad idea, in principle. The problem is, it works on one point. You probably all know in 1994, the second Arab country makes peace with Israel. Jordan, also truly great. It has existed ever since and has never been taken back. There is currently a strong security cooperation between Israel and Jordan. Jordan played an important role in 2024 when Iran attacked Israel directly with its military for the first time. It was Jordanian fighter jets that shot down many of the drones. They were directly involved in the military defense of Israel without a doubt. That's quite something. It's a robust peace treaty, even more so with military cooperation. However, it unfortunately didn't really work, as the peace process with the Palestinians failed by the late 90s. One reason: from the very beginning, there was a power that sought to sabotage this rapprochement. Naturally, the Iranian regime. Before Oslo, there was this conference in Madrid at the end of the 80s. Iran immediately hosts a counter-conference in Tehran, forming the rejectionist front. So all those who continue to insist Khartoum's 3 nines of 1967 still hold true here. No recognition, no peace, no negotiations with Israel. Anyone who disagrees is shot, like Sadat. That's the Iranian regime's policy. In the 90s, they helped bomb this peace process, completely destroying it. Many of you are familiar with those images of bombed-out buses, invariably displayed to illustrate the Second Intifada, starting from the 2000s. The most famous images shown are from 1995 and 1996. Back then, especially in 1996, the Iranian regime was already encouraging and supporting Hamas and similar groups to carry out exactly these kinds of suicide bombings to bomb the peace process into oblivion. So, by the late 90s, this peace process fails. For a long time, only those 2 Arab states truly had a peace treaty with Israel, but that dynamic changes in 2020. The Iranian regime does everything it can to prevent any further Arab-Israeli rapprochement. They sabotage it, backing HIZBOLLAHHAMAS, Islamic Jihad, and Yemen's Ansar Allah groups. And yet, or perhaps precisely because of this, in response, in the year 2020, 3 additional significant Arab nations, some of which are establishing contact and forging agreements with Israel, while others are truly establishing peace with Israel. And a 4th one could be added to that, if you will, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco and Bahrain. Bahrain is a small nation, not particularly significant by itself, but it's important and relevant because practically nothing occurs there without the explicit approval of Riyadh, meaning Saudi Arabia. And I want to emphasize 2 crucial points regarding these Abraham Accords, as they truly represent the counter-narrative to the Iranian regime's persistent attempts to hold this region hostage with its utterly destructive and anti-Semitic agenda. There are just 2 aspects of the Abraham Accords I'd like to mention, which seem particularly important to me for the current discussion. Firstly, these agreements extend far beyond the scope of the Israeli-Egyptian and Israeli-Jordanian peace treaties. And secondly, they are augmented by additional frameworks, which, regrettably, appear to be largely unfamiliar at this point, indicating that a truly comprehensive concept of enhanced regional security is being diligently presented and implemented. First, to my initial point, what do I mean by further? The peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan have, for a start, changed almost nothing about the rampant anti-Semitism among the Jordanian and especially the Egyptian populations. And the governments, particularly in Egypt, are not lifting a finger to do anything about this, not even the slightest effort. On the contrary, even in Egyptian government newspapers under Mubarak or today under El-Sisi, you'll find terrible anti-Semitic propaganda. And I mean real anti-Semitic propaganda, not some kind of criticism of Zionism or something, but classic anti-Semitic hate speech. The Abraham Accords, which strive on every conceivable level to foster a strong relationship with Israel. This means more than just a political connection, not merely a cold peace, like what you might call the situations with Egypt and Jordan. No, it's really more akin to the Franco-German friendship, you know? The situation with Egypt isn't like a Franco-German friendship with student and scientific exchanges, or even culinary festivals. But what it does mean is there's no war, which in the Middle East is already a significant achievement. With the United Arab Emirates, where it's perhaps most evident it goes far beyond that, there is extreme economic cooperation. It's estimated that the trade volume will soon reach 10 billion. euros, so incredible sums, which is no wonder, because it's an incredibly prosperous, rich country, and with Israel as a startup nation, new patents are constantly being registered. It's a match. Yeah, they just fit together perfectly. Tourism. After the Accords in 2020, and remember, that was during the pandemic with travel restrictions and all that, not thousands, not tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of Israelis traveled to the United Arab Emirates and said, let's go check this out. Not quite as many Emiratis came to Israel, but that was also epidemiologically questionable at the time. But this demonstrates that significant developments are also occurring at the societal level. There is military cooperation also with the United Arab Emirates. Yes, there are. There have been official discussions about positioning Israeli air defense systems within the United Arab Emirates, which clearly indicates that there are multiple underlying reasons for this development. One major concern is the Iranian threat. It's not just Israel that perceives Iran's nuclear weapons program and its evident expansionism as an extreme danger. Many Gulf states also share this profound concern. In recent years, including during Trump's first term, the United States has not proven itself to be a dependable ally to these nations. This is also quite important to recall, perhaps for the discussion concerning the current Trump proposals. So, pro-Israel supporters might argue, yes, but he relocated the embassy to Jerusalem. That's fine, but he conspicuously failed to respond to the military assaults on the Saudi Arabian oil refinery. And that made many in the Middle East quite insecure, including the Israelis. Right? That was a major military drone attack during Trump's term on the most important oil refinery in Saudi Arabia, one of the most important in the world, a huge infrastructure project. And everyone in the Middle East thought there would be a military response because Trump was president. There was nothing. That's one of the main reasons why these nations then decided they must align themselves with the strong, powerful regional countries against Iran. Who is that? Israel. So, the shared threat emanating from Iran is one of the pivotal reasons why these Abraham Accords were brought into existence. The most significant way they go beyond previous peace agreements, and where I see the greatest positive potential for the future, is that they are connected not merely to an anti-Semitism stance, but to an active and engaged policy against it. What do I mean? Saudi Arabia best illustrates this. They are not yet Abraham Accords members, but have been preparing for a long time. And they are doing exactly the same thing as Morocco and the Emirates are doing. They are stopping the anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish propaganda in their countries. In Saudi Arabia, you can always make this so vividly clear. In Saudi Arabia, in most Friday sermons for decades, the classics of Islamic anti-Jewish sentiment were propagated. Other Islamic traditions exist, but they are irrelevant here. Instead, these anti-Jewish traditions also exist and were propagated. For instance, Friday preachers in these nations, including Saudi Arabia, consistently asserted, Jews are descendants of apes and swine. This is one of those classic disparaging notions, primarily originating from early Islamic teachings. The Saudi government then decided, we won't say that anymore. The good thing about a dictatorship is it stays that way. Then, some clerics, who for 2 decades preached Jews descended from apes and pigs, would declare in their Friday sermon, no, we are all descendants of Abraham. And from that, you can also perceive that this is certainly a tactical maneuver, and it can always be reversed. And one really has to ask, how serious is this? But for starters, for years now, the message has been, no, the Jews are our brothers and sisters. The Saudi envoys in Paris and Washington were both specifically instructed to attend the large local synagogues on Yom Kippur and other significant Jewish holidays. And this was reported on the front pages of Saudi newspapers. This means they want the population to see, okay, the Jews are no longer our enemies. Because, from a long-term perspective, right, they wish to join these Abraham Accords, which, by the way, is not just coincidentally named that. It's quite intentional. This term Abraham, this name Abraham, it essentially signifies a desire to fundamentally reinforce a different narrative of one's own religion, one that champions interreligious dialogue, but also much more than that, specifically emphasizing their shared foundational origins, so to speak. In the UAE, where this has progressed notably, Abraham centers are being founded. So that's a mosque, a church, and a synagogue. You see? 3 buildings. They hire the greatest, most expensive architects, and they put up these kinds of things. You can already, it's already there, you can view it, right? But in Morocco and the United Arab Emirates, it goes much further than that. And that, I believe, is absolutely the best thing. In both countries, the respective ministries of education are already officially trying to implement this. It's no longer like it used to be. As I mentioned, this is currently under discussion and being debated. This is already underway. They are actively cleansing both school and university curricula of all this anti-Semitic garbage. This propaganda, it's just being completely eradicated, you see. In part, this also applies to the image of women that's being conveyed. So, a completely insane, misogynistic, anti-woman image, according to Sharia. So, the opposite of the restricted women image propagated so far, that's being toned down, even in Saudi Arabia. And in Morocco and the United Arab Emirates, there's ongoing discussion. Now conferences are even taking place where they are considering how to best implement Holocaust education, which entails teaching about the National Socialist persecution and extermination of Jews into their school and university curricula. And these are, and I don't often use such words, but these are truly revolutionary developments within these societies. This was simply unimaginable just a few years back. The Emirates are taking it further. As an Arab nation, they dispatched a full delegation to Auschwitz for the March of the Living, a truly significant step forward. Right? Just a few years ago, people would still say, the Holocaust? We're not quite sure if it really occurred. There. Indeed, in the United Arab Emirates, the very first Holocaust remembrance event has already been held and completed. The Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, was played in the United Arab Emirates, specifically for Holocaust Remembrance Day. Completely unimaginable a few years ago. So that's what I mean when I say it goes far beyond that. And it has the potential, one must admit we are still a long way from it, mind you, but it genuinely has the potential to instigate sustainable domestic political changes within these nations too. Because I'd always argue that, I mean, when you read German newspapers, you often get the impression that the settlements are at the very core of the Middle East conflict. Right? If those are gone, everything will be fine. Anyone who says that, of course, has no idea about the conflict's history or its current state. Even though settlement policy is a highly controversial topic, and rightly so, it's often overemphasized as the core issue. But that's not the Gordian knot that is at stake here. Rather, what is central is the unwavering steadfastness and persistent nature of these anti-Semitic responses prevalent within Arab societies. So the fact that people always react to the real conflict which does exist with these anti-Semitic projections. This isn't by chance. It's because for decades, state propaganda has deliberately pushed this narrative. Because this very real conflict was interpreted through the distorted lens of traditional Islamic Jew hatred and pervasive modern anti-Semitism. And if you begin there and declare, we're bringing an end to this now, that approach holds significantly greater potential for fostering a truly lasting and peaceful development over the long term. And if that's what you truly desire, and observing the time, I should probably begin to conclude, as I'm sure you already have numerous questions, and quite possibly objections. If you want this development to continue, then you can also formulate pretty precisely what would be necessary right now. Also in relation to some proposals that were on the table yesterday, if one truly desires peace in the Middle East, and that's a monumental concept, you could also simplify it and say, if you merely seek any form of rapprochement, if you wish to improve the situation for all parties involved, then you must confront the enemies of peace, and do so through military action. And these adversaries of peace include the Iranian regime, Hezbollah, and still Hamas, which, despite being significantly weakened, persists in areas like the West Bank, even maintaining military capabilities. Also on this list are Islamic Jihad, Ansar Allah, and various other entities allied with the Iranian regime. You see, that hasn't gone away. I cut myself short earlier. Ring of Fire, nuclear weapons program. Both, of course, still exist, even though the nuclear weapons program has now become more urgent. This Ring of Fire has, in a certain sense, been broken up. Militarily, Hamas in Gaza is no longer a factor. Hezbollah, at the very least, is considerably weakened. However, estimates suggest that approximately a third of its rocket arsenal has been destroyed. Well, 2/3 of 150,000 is still a significant amount. No, I just want to say they haven't vanished. They are actively attempting to regroup themselves. Iran continues to finance them. Their main route was simply lost to them. This occurred because, following the weakening of Hezbollah and the Iranian regime itself, the Iranian regime's great ally in Syria, the Assad dictatorship, was overthrown. The Assad dictatorship had only been in power because the Iranian regime, Hezbollah, and then Russia had kept it in power. It was unequivocally clear that once military support was gone, the Assad dictatorship would collapse. A colleague of mine in Haifa, who often dealt with the police, always used to say that the police force from Haifa could win a war against the Syrian army. So they never really posed a significant military threat to Israel? That's probably an overstatement, but what I'm trying to say is it was clear that if Hezbollah and the Iranian regime were so weakened, there would be no one left to keep Assad in power, as he couldn't do it himself. In that regard, this too was a direct consequence of the significant weakening of both Hezbollah and the Iranian regime. However, none of this has vanished entirely. Firstly, because no reputable person can genuinely predict what the future holds, or what will emanate from the new rulers in Syria, given that it's still completely unclear precisely who these new rulers are, or who precisely constitutes their ranks, and what their intentions and actions will ultimately bring forth. Currently, we're witnessing a relatively pragmatic policy, yet a pragmatic approach from Islamists must always be handled with the utmost caution and wariness. That's the current situation. However, what's particularly relevant to this ring of fire discussion is that the Iranian regime has already initiated its destabilization policies. Yes, there are already groups in Syria that aren't forming anew, they're just renaming themselves. Yes, so right now, for example, the Islamic Resistance Movement. They are already actively engaged, having launched attacks on Israeli soldiers within this buffer zone, which the Israeli army, for extremely sound strategic reasons, promptly established and secured. They have already conducted attacks there. They originated from that old, genuinely Nazi-esque party in Syria. But they've renamed themselves the Islamic Resistance Movement. Islamic Resistance, that's what they're called. And they've also immediately gotten a symbol that looks almost exactly like Hezbollah's. And that will be the Iranian regime's policy. They, of course, want to destabilize the situation there. They have absolutely no interest in allowing an Islamist regime, one specifically directed against Iran, to establish itself there in Syria. Thus, they must act exactly as they did in Iraq after Saddam Hussein's fall from power. The current Iranian perspective is, if we can't have Assad back, then we'll gladly take 20 years of chaos, murder, and civil war. They will try to initiate that, and they've already started. So one must be prepared for that. Other allies, such as Ansar Allah, have not yet been weakened in any way. That's what people here always call the Houthi rebels in Yemen, right? A group that should have been on one's radar for about 15 years, but that most people only became aware of after October 7th, because they suddenly started firing rockets at Israel too. And that's no surprise at all. This is a group that was previously supported by Iran and then grew extremely close, ideologically, to both Iran and Hezbollah. They're not exactly the same. In fact, they possess a somewhat different ideology. For example, they're more openly anti-Jewish. Yes? Well, you'd have to achieve that first. But it is actually true that the Iranian regime, in its rhetoric and propaganda, always claims, we have absolutely nothing against Jews. You'd always have to append, yes, provided they accept their dhimmi status and the dominion of Islam and so forth. But their propaganda states, we have nothing against Jews, only against the Zionists. You certainly won't hear that from Ansar Allah. Their logo already has death to the Jews written on it, so they are much more aggressive and open about it. Hezbollah was like that too, by the way. People always forget that. So they are ideologically very close to the Iranian regime, but they are even more openly anti-Jewish. Nasrallah, who is no longer with us, I know. He repeatedly said that Jews are descended from apes and pigs. You don't really hear that from high-ranking Iranian officials, right? It's kind of, well, that's just a little too open. Right? They're too refined for that, so to speak. My favorite speech by Hassan Nasrallah was always one that sounds almost Zionist at the beginning. In a programmatic speech, he once stated, "It is quite beneficial if all Jews assemble within Israel." This is, as we know, something Zionists also assert. But the speech went on. It's good for all Jews to gather in Israel. It saves us the trouble of having to hunt them down all over the world, right? That is Hezbollah, which still isn't fully designated by the EU. Designated in its entirety as a terrorist organization. And perhaps to return to that point once more, and because I previously forgot to mention it when I briefly digressed into German-Iranian policy, then I will truly bring this to a close. It's not exclusively about Iranian trade. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps remains notably absent from the terror watch list. Right? And it's the German government, among others, that Well, they always say we'd actually be for it, but there are legal concerns and so on. That's absolute humbug, okay? There isn't even the legal opinion from the EU that Ms. Baerbock then referred to. It absolutely doesn't say that in there. And it is claimed that it states reasons why it wouldn't be possible. That's incorrect. Of course, it would be entirely feasible. It's about political will, and it would be a significantly positive move still, by the way, to designate the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Pasdaran, especially those responsible for foreign operations, the Quds force of the Pasdaran, on every conceivable terror list, as that would indeed entail considerable consequences, including for Iran-related trade. But I wanted to quickly touch on the second point, the nuclear weapons program, and then I'll really be at the end. This is what's known as the ring of fire of proxies. It has at least been broken, but it's not gone. And Iran, the Iranian regime, will try to make it stronger again, to tighten it up even more. They will find themselves constrained by this, and what Donald Trump did yesterday with this new maximum pressure policy, involving extensive sanctions against Iran and even against nations like China, currently the primary purchasers of Iranian crude oil, is a very positive development indeed. That was actually the absolute best point that was announced there yesterday. There will be massive sanctions, putting immense pressure on the Iranian regime, which is beneficial in every way. Even if it doesn't prevent them from building a bomb, they'll simply have fewer resources to fund their other illicit activities. So that is definitely a good development. However, the nuclear weapons program won't simply vanish on its own as a result of this action. And I believe that will be the central question moving forward, what exactly transpires there. So the only thing, if someone now asks, what will it be like in the coming months? I don't know either. The only thing I can tell you is that the Iranian nuclear program will be a major topic in the coming months, because they are now truly on the brink of developing and deploying fully functional nuclear weapons. And by that, I no longer mean just being able to enrich enough uranium to arm a bomb, but truly operational nuclear weapons, including nuclear warheads and so on and so forth. And that is a situation that we really haven't encountered in this specific way before. And what that means is this crucial question of whether or not. Yitzhak Rabin was perhaps right in his suspicion that the whole world might abandon Israel to face this existential problem alone, an existential problem for Israel, referring to the nuclear arming of this regime. This issue will likely become undeniably clear in the coming months, or at the very latest, within the next few years, to an extent that I can at least guarantee you it will also. Will likely feature quite prominently in broader media coverage, the only truly sensible German contribution to this situation. Is exactly what I've demanded for 15 years, a complete U-turn in German Iran and Mideast policy. And that would quite simply signify absolutely no support whatsoever for this current regime, while simultaneously providing complete and unwavering support for the democratic rule of law and secular opposition that demonstrably exists both within Iran and among those in exile. Because ultimately, and incidentally, I'm extremely skeptical of the Trump administration's stance on this, ultimately, only the complete overthrow of this horrific regime will permanently eliminate all dangers from this regime, including nuclear armament. And that's why it's about this overthrow. Thank you.
A production of MENA Watch, the independent Middle East think tank. On our website, you will find daily updated information and in-depth analyses. Please visit us.